Hello, and welcome to the Vineyard View. I'm your host, Ann Bassett, coming to you from MVTV, community television here on Martha's Vineyard Island. Today, I am honored to be able to welcome Victoria Wilson to talk about her time on the island, growing up, talk about her jobs as both vice president and senior editor at Knopf. She's also going to talk about not only her book on Barbara Stanwyck, which is an amazing book. We're going to talk about that in depth. But we're also going to talk about how she shepherded Janet Massinio through Casting into the Light. So, Victoria, thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
And you did grow up on the vineyard. Tell us about that.
Well, first of all, I have to say that the vineyard totally has shaped my life. We left the island. First of all, we came to the island when I was 6 months old. My parents were from New York. My father was a physicist who became a writer. And they sailed up here one time with a friend who was a physicist and his wife who was a Denishon dancer and also a rockette. And they fell in love with the island. And they decided they were going to move up here. I was born, and 6 months later we came up. And so I spent my idyllic childhood here. And my entire life, I say this without exaggeration, has been shaped by this island.
Fabulous. Which schools did you go to?
Well, I went to kindergarten in Tisbury, and then I went to first grade, and then we moved back to New York. But I came back every summer, and I stayed with Shirley and John Painter because Jenny Painter was my best friend and still is my oldest friend, and we had many adventures together, got into a great deal of trouble, but the Painters really became my second family up here.
Lovely.
And, you know, John Painter built the Machine and Marine Company with Miles Carpenter, and he built his house out in Hines Point. And I will say that many of the dreams that I have take place in the lagoon and on that dock that we spend so much time jumping off of.
Wow. Well, I didn't meet Jenny until she was waitressing at the Black Dog, which is the same time that Janet Massinio is there. So those were lively days. Those were terrific days.
Those were great days. I had a friend who I went to Goddard College with who opened a jewelry store here. He's Mark Lender.
Oh, yes.
Mark Lender / Goldsmith. And Mark and I used to go to the Black Dog all the time for lunch, and he would go out to Hines Point and go swimming at the end of the day. But the funny story is, I was just saying this last night to Janet, that I had worked with her for about a year and a half before I bought her book, Casting into the Light. And we worked many, many, many drafts. And then I finally bought the book, and then we worked many, many more drafts. And at a certain point, she sent me a photograph, which I guess I had asked for. I don't remember how it came about. And I looked at the photograph, and I said, oh my God, I know this woman. She used to wait on me at the Black Dog.
Exactly.
But right. I remembered her. I mean, I never went to Helios, and I did go to the home port, but Jane and I were just there the other day. My friend Jane Friedman, who I've known for many years, who worked with me at Alfred Knopf, but we'll get to that later. I don't remember Janet from the home port, but I definitely remember her from the Black Dog.
Oh, God. Janet says that her book is as good as it is because she worked with you for 4 years in shaping that book, and that it's a much better book than it would have been. You asked her for more details. You asked her to take things out. Tell us about that process.
Well, to begin with, when I got the way I got the book is a great story. I got the book, the manuscript came to me as a proposal first, and there was an accompanying letter, and the letter said, Jenny Seward, I think, suggested that I write to you. And so that opened many doors. That opened all doors, because I said, oh, that's interesting. Jenny had this woman send me this. And it was a book on surf casting. And I said, you know, I really don't care about surf casting. And I really don't, I eat fish, but I really feel for the fish. And so I'm not a fisher person. But I started reading it. And, you know, just because somebody suggests, you know, a book comes through a friend and you start to read it because of that friendship or connection, the writing has to stand on its own. And I started reading it, and I said, this woman has a voice. And she's a storyteller, and she summons up this island that I know so well. And it was an amazing story because the passion for fishing pulled her through just about everything. And if there's one thing I understand, it's obsession and having a passion for something. And she really communicated this, and it needed work, but the point is she did the work.
She did. She does. Whether she's fishing, doing taxidermy, whatever Janet does, she does it, as you say, with passion, and it shows.
And you know, it's very, that kind of passion and obsession is very appealing if somebody can communicate it. And the amazing thing is, as I was reading the proposal, and I'm reading along and I'm saying, oh my God, this is amazing. I thought, there's no way I'm going to be able to publish this book, but it's just so interesting and I'm so drawn to it. And then in the midst of everything, there it is, she said she wanted to become a fish taxidermist. And I said, oh, you couldn't make this up. This is just too good. I have to have this book. And of course, it was great that it worked out. And so in a lot of ways, it's my love letter through Janet's book to the Vineyard.
Ah, nicely said. Nicely said indeed. Now, your book on Barbara Stanwyck is astounding. It is, first of all, a definitive work, but I read a lot of actors and actresses, especially from the 40s, which of course the golden age of Hollywood. I read a lot of those, and a lot of them are puff pieces. A lot of them just deal with, knew this famous person, knew that. You go comprehensively into what's happening politically in the United States, what's happening with all of the people that she meets. You go into her feelings, my goodness, how long did you do research on this book?
Well, the book was, to begin with, it was a famously late book. It was under contract to Simon & Schuster for many years. I have a rather large full-time job. But it wasn't just the job. It was how I didn't set out to write. I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, I've been in publishing. I've been an editor for 1,000 years, and I just publish a lot of biographies, and I get very involved with the research and the subject of the people who I publish. And I thought, you know, this is it's an interesting form because it's really the sort of evolutionary step of fiction, because it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, which a lot of fiction didn't have for a very long time. And so it was interesting, and of course it's about something large, because why would you write a biography of someone who, except for perhaps Joseph Cornell or somebody like that, who had a sort of flatlined life. But the book sort of revealed itself to me how I was going to write it, because Stanwyck, to begin with, comes from was born in Brooklyn, and she's a Brooklyn gal, and she was, of the streets, and some of the, that is true. But Stanwyck is really a daughter of the American Revolution. She comes from a very, very old New England family, and mother's family comes from Nova Scotia, and her father's family comes from Maine, and they settled in Lanesville. I went to Lanesville, and in looking at the town, I saw all of the different places where her family came from, her mother and her father and her 3 very older sisters. And her father was a mason. I thought, what an odd job. I wonder why he became a mason. Well, he was going to go to law school, and then his father died. And so he had to take a job locally, and he took a job in the granite company. There was a granite company right in the middle of the town. And what they would do is and of course I started researching this, and it was fascinating. And what they would do is they would take all of this huge stone, carry it down to these huge ships that had come into the harbor, and carry the stone all up and down the East Coast. And why were they doing that? Because it was during the Industrial Revolution. And the reason why that was interesting to me is because had the Industrial Revolution not happened, they wouldn't have left their small town. They would have stayed in Lanesville or Somerville, where they ultimately moved. And what happened in Stanwyck's life wouldn't have happened. Her mother wouldn't have fallen off a trolley, pregnant, and septicemia set in when she started to hemorrhage, and ultimately she died of septicemia. The whole life would have been completely different. But because of all this disruption and this movement that was going on in America, families were flocking to, and of course there was the great movie made, I think it was with Janet Gaynor, called Sunrise, about this small town girl who moves to the city, and of course havoc and tragedy ensues. But that's how I got into it. And then I realized I was interested in, it took me a long time to get to this understanding, but I realized I was interested in, it's a story of America in that century. And with the chance of Stanwyck's politics were very different from mine. And she was against, not that I was alive under Roosevelt, but she was against Roosevelt. She was a Republican in the old sense of the word. So I could write about, it wasn't interesting just to say, well, she detested FDR. So the way I went about it was that I wanted to write about FDR to show with power that she was against him and what that meant. She was against unions. She was forced to belong to the Screen Actors Guild, which had just formed. And as I was writing the book, I realized that I was really writing the story of, in a way, it was my parents' America, which is why I got in so much of the labor history, but I also got in a lot of theater history to show how, I mean, she became a huge star on Broadway. She was a hoofer for many years, but then she became a big, big star. And I wanted to show what was going on in the theater and how the styles of theater had changed after the First World War, and how naturalism had come into being, and who had influenced her style. Because in any movie that Stanwyck is in, regardless of how creaky it may be, she stands out, and she stands out because she is modern and because she's stripped down of sort of period artifice.
Exactly, and there's no pretension at all. And you say she was against unions, and yet she befriended every single person on the set, the people who did the lighting, I mean, you make it very clear that she had no pretensions and that people liked her, and she was voted their favorite actress after one particular film. Everybody signed a petition saying she was their favorite actress.
Well, one of the things that people don't really write about when they write these books, I mean, there are a lot of things in the book that most people don't write about, but one of the things that I became aware of with Stanwyck is that she was, she left school she went to PS, I think it was 52, and she left at 8th grade, which is when they graduated then. She did not go to high school. She went out and got many, many jobs. And at a certain point, she began to educate herself. And I had to give a talk at the Mount, which was Edith Wharton's home. And I thought, Edith Wharton and Barbara Stanwyck, how can you possibly connect them? But I found a way, and I did connect them. And that is that Edith Wharton's mother did not come from a rich family, and the name was, I think the name was Stevens. I think her name was Stevens. But what was interesting was that Edith Wharton he was a very sort of exalted figure in New York, but he educated her about reading. And Stanwyck had educated herself. She didn't have this figure in her life, but she educated herself, and she read everything. And first she read garbage, and then she read more and more interesting writers, and she read throughout her life. Reading was absolutely essential to her. I mean, the way I see it, and what I say in the book, is that it alleviated her loneliness.
Yes. And she was a lonely person and didn't make friends easily or well. And of course, being married to Frank Fay, he kept her in a bubble and told her what to wear, etc. Talk about Frank. I knew Barbara Stanwyck and her movies of the 40s. The earlier things I didn't know about, so this was a revelation. And I never knew about her marriage to Frank Fay and how devastating that was in her life.
Well, you know, Frank Fay was a great character to write about. He was considered a monster. But the first thing about him is that all stand-up comedy comes from Frank Fay. He was a monologist, that's what it was called, and he would play the Palace for 52 weeks, earning $5,000 a week in 1925. $5,000 a week in 1925 was a huge amount of money, and he had an entourage, and he had everything, and he was considered a god. And what he would do is he would stand on stage and he would talk very simply and sort of tell stories, and it would seem as if he was talking improvisationally, and he would be talking about, let's say, your uncle who collected string or was a mustache twirler, and he would go on, and the audience would be just hysterical. But he did it all very simply. I remember, I think it was Steve Allen who had written something about him, where Frank Fay got on the stage and there was a table, and on the table was a toaster, and he got on the stage and he was making toast, drinking coffee, and that was it. And he was, you know, he might be talking, but he might not be saying anything, and they were just howling. They adored him. And James Cagney said that he learned to act from watching Frank Fay because of the simplicity. Fay had been acting since he was 2 years old. I mean, he'd been in everything, but he had developed this, and he was considered to be the master of ceremonies on Broadway. And through Oscar Levant, I mean, it's a whole long story, and if you read the book,
That's right.
You'll find out about it. But he was fascinating because he was anti-Semitic. I interviewed Milton Berle when he was 92 years old. And I can see why women loved Milton Berle, because even at 92 years old, he was sexy, I have to say. And he loved women. And that just came through.
And that shows.
Yeah, it just came through, and it was so great, even as he was controlling the microphone and the tape recorder and all of that. At 92, Milton Berle still remembered Frank Fay's entire monologue from the one time he saw him. And these comedians were not supposed to stand in the wings because you weren't supposed to steal other people's material. And one time Berle did. He was intense, but what happened was that Oscar Levant, who was the great musician and pianist, was in a play with Barbara Stanwyck, her big starring role called Burlesque, directed by Arthur Hopkins, who was a major producer and director, and very important in bringing modernism to the stage. And Levant introduced Barbara Stanwyck to Frank Fay, and they went backstage, and there were some other people there, and Fay was very charming, and then he said, let's all go out. I know a great place. We'll go out, and then he turned to, and she was all set, and then he turned to Barbara Stanwyck, who was then Barbara Stanwyck and no longer Ruby Stevens, and said, well, very nice meeting you. And Stanwyck was furious. And she said, okay, I'm going to get this guy. And so then they made a date. I forget the restaurant, but I even had that. And they made a date, and Frank Fay is there, and Stanwyck does not show up. So very quickly, they each showed one another who they were. And of course, Fay had done it deliberately to torture her, revealing who he was. But when they finally got together, he was very possessive. And she didn't have a mother. She didn't have a father. I mean, imagine losing your mother at 4 years old. Yeah. She had these 3 older sisters, but they had their own families. They were starting their own families. Her father, when her mother died, could not sort of cope with the loss, and he ran off. He got a job on the Panama Canal and ran off and left them. She had a brother who was 2 years older. So Stanwyck, in a way, I think she felt comforted by being possessed in that way. I think that was, she felt that she had a home, a sense of belonging. His love for her, I think, made her feel safe in the world.
Yes, and you really do explain that and show that. He wanted to be adored, and she adored him.
She definitely adored him. Well, you know, I devote an entire chapter to this story, Making of A Star Is Born, because A Star Is Born was written by William Wellman, who directed Barbara Stanwyck in a number of movies. And Wellman was this fabulous character, this small, wiry guy who was very tough, and he had directed a lot of, you know, Public Enemy, and a lot of, he's the one who tricked Mae Clarke into having the grapefruit stuffed in her face. And Mae Clarke and Barbara Stanwyck had been great friends, but that's another whole story. Yes, again, read the book, you'll hear about it, but it's an interesting story. Anyway, so Wellman directed Stanwyck in a number of movies, a lot of really good movies. And I write about those movies for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons why I do is because Wellman is watching Stanwyck's marriage once they get to Hollywood, because she didn't want to go to Hollywood. She had just had this huge success. Arthur Hopkins had just offered her a play that was based on the Ruth Snyder murder. And the Ruth Snyder case eventually ended up, I think 11 years later, being made into a movie based on the James M. Cain novel Double Indemnity. And Billy Wilder made that. And so again, she was meant to be in that movie, but she'd been offered this huge play by Arthur Hopkins, and so she wanted to stay in New York. Warner Brothers wanted Frank Fay desperately to go out to Hollywood. And so she went with him. She was not happy, and Nick Skank, I think it was Nick Skank, brought her out to make a movie called The Locked Door. It was one contract, one movie, and she made it. And she was ready to go back, and he didn't want to. And the problem with Frank Fay is that had he gone from Broadway to television 40 years later, he would have been fine. But they didn't know what to do with him in the movies. So they made him this Latin lover, they made him a French lover. It had nothing to do with who he was or his talent. And so, of course, this great star on Broadway was really not having a good time in Hollywood, and it was getting very hard for him. The movies were not successful, but they kept making more and more. He then signed, I think it was a 3-contract deal with Warner Brothers. And Stanwyck, in the meantime, had made this other movie called Mexicali Rose, which was a disaster. And Frank Capra was making a movie called Ladies of Leisure, and he wanted Stanwyck to audition, and she said, "That's it, no more auditions." And she had made an audition somewhat earlier, an interesting audition with Alexander Korda, who had it with Hollywood. He was on his way out, but they asked him to make this audition, and the photographer was Ray Ranahan, the great color photographer, who I think he did Gone with the Wind, among many other things. So what she did was her great breakthrough scene in her first big play, The Noose. And it was an amazing scene. It was a scene that I describe in the book in detail, because I managed through various reports and descriptions to get a real description of what happened when she begs for the life of this man who she thinks has been murdered and who pays no attention to her and is in love with someone else. And then she discovers he's alive. That was an electric moment in that play, and that's what changed her life. Anyway, so there it was on film. And so what happened is that Frank Fay, she said, "I refuse to make any, I'm just not doing it. I don't care, I'm not making any more auditions," and that's it. So Frank Fay got a copy of this screen test, and he brought it around to Frank Capra, and he made Frank Capra watch it. And Capra watched it, and I maintain that in watching her in that way, as somebody who was very different, who had this modernism, this naturalism, and who projected this complexity and sexiness. I maintain that he basically fell in love with her watching that. And then he worked with her in many movies, and of course everything changed. But you see, the thing is, with Wellman worked with her in various movies as the sort of flashpoint of this marriage was building up. And so he was aware of what was going on in that marriage, even though she wasn't talking about it. And he used it when he wrote A Star is Born with Robert Carson. And there were three other couples who are the basis, the models for Norman Maine and Vicki Lester. And I write about who they are and what happens to them, and they're amazing characters, and Wellman knew them all. And he put it all together, and Stanwyck would always say, "I'm Mrs. Frank Fay," and there's Vicki Lester who says, "I'm Mrs. Norman Maine."
Right. Oh, you tie it all in. You give us so much history. When you talk about producers and directors, you give us Pandro Berman, and you give us Michael Curtiz, and you give us Mr. Wellman. And it's all, again, in context about movies that they're working on, and you list the movies, and the actors and actresses who are emerging at that time. So you also talk about how things are changing in Hollywood, how it's going from black and white to color, how it's going from silent to, because all of that is relevant to
Right.
Barbara's story.
Well, Ladies of Leisure was made into a silent movie first, and then they dubbed it, and so she was in a couple of silent movies, and she was there at exactly that moment when it was changing, and it was a revolution. And then there she was in television at the moment when television was coming in, and she desperately wanted to be in television, and she was. And what she wanted to do in television, way ahead of her time, of course, was that she wanted to do Westerns. And she said, "I don't want to just be, with the ladies at home," because she said, those women didn't just stay home with their crinolines. They were out there forging the path across the country and making America. And that's what she wanted to be part of. And it took a long, long time before she got that kind of series for herself. But she was in television for 20 years.
It's, as I say, you take us from silent movies right up to, and this is only volume 1.
And this is only volume 1. And I said, it ends just before the Second World War, and she's just about to make Meet John Doe, and all of the sort of great iconic pictures that she has made are still to come. And everyone said, how can you write a book and not have Meet John Doe, Lady Eve, Double Indemnity, all of these movies? And I said, believe me, you're not even going to notice it. You're not going to miss it. And people didn't, because the life is so rich. And the movies that she made, you see, I wrote about how she changed in the movies. And I had to write about the movies because most people, even people who know movies, hadn't seen a lot of these movies. And
True.
it served me well that for all of these decades that I've been writing flaps copy at Alfred A. Knopf, which I call Alfred A. Gesundheit, served me well because I know how to describe something without sort of dragging it down, and you move through it quickly. But I wanted to show how she changed in each of these movies and how these directors influenced her.
And you make that very, very clear. It's a page turner. The book is a page turner.
Thank you.
And I haven't even, as I say, finished the first. Now, has the second volume been published yet?
No, because I'm still writing it.
I see. And how's that going?
Well, slow and steady.
Okay. Do you have a goal date?
No. And Simon & Schuster is being great again because, either that or they got this book. They didn't really know what they had. I knew what it was, and it's had a nice reception, and it's done well. And it's not an inexpensive book, but it's done very well. And now it's great because there's so many people who write to me and say, when is volume 2 coming? And I always say, well, it's better than they say, when is volume 2 coming? Than they say, don't bother, we've read volume 1, it's enough.
Right, I do hear you. Can we talk about publishing for a minute?
Sure.
Because I'm fascinated by your job. And I just give you a little background. I was the events coordinator at the Bunch of Grapes for 10 years and loved working in a really good independent bookstore and went to a lot of ABA meetings, and Ann Nelson had done a very good job in creating a good bookstore. So I started in the late 90s and into the early 2000s. And people were saying, well, we're seeing the demise of publishing in the United States. There were mergers, there were bankruptcies, bookstores were going out of business. It was a tumultuous time. And one of the things I was hearing is no editors are taking time with new authors anymore. And that's why the industry is in trouble. So when I was talking to Janet, and she said that you spent years with her on her first book, wow, talk a little about your job.
Well, I have to explain Alfred Knopf.
Please.
It's really
highly regarded.
Oh, absolutely. And I started in 1915 by Alfred A. Knopf and Blanche Knopf. And, you know, his idea was that the book was an object and it was supposed to be beautiful. And there have been only 3 heads of that company. And that's Alfred Knopf, Robert Gottlieb, and Sonny Mehta. Now that's amazing for a company like this. And the basic thing about Alfred Knopf is that it is the town that time forgot. It is in a world unto itself. The books are still beautiful. And, you know, I've been very lucky I didn't know, I mean, I've met Mr. Knopf, who I just remember he would walk into the office and he looked like, you know, Mr. Monopoly man. He wore those dentist shoes where, you know, they're molded. And he was very sweet. At that point, he was married to Helen Knopf. Blanche had gone the way of all flesh. But there were many stories about, I mean, there was a woman who sold foreign rights, who also, one of her jobs was to brush Blanche's wigs. And there are many Knopf stories before my time. And then Bob Gottlieb came from Simon & Schuster, and he changed everything. And he brought with him all of that spirit of Simon & Schuster. And you know, it was sort of circular to me, because when my parents sailed up here, the people in publishing who were living up here, up in Menemsha, were the Bonais and the Liverites. And then Albert Leventhal came, and then George Braziller, and there was a whole group of publishing people. And one of Albert Leventhal's assistants was Bob Bernstein, who ultimately left and who went to go to Random House, and who ultimately brought Bob Gottlieb and Tony Schulte and Nina Bourne with him to run Knopf. And so Knopf had the old feeling of Knopf, but it had the spirit and the openness and the fun of the great Simon & Schuster days, which I never knew. But these people were big, big figures, and they had a great sense of fun and and publishing was so new and it was small, and so that's, you know, that's the way Knopf is. And so, I mean, I've worked with Janet for quite a while before I said, okay, now I can show this manuscript. It's ready to show other people. It's a place where all the editors have a great deal of freedom. And, you know, publishing has changed, but it keeps changing. It keeps evolving. I mean, when I got to Knopf, it was owned by RCA. And then it was owned by, and then the great days of, you know, Newhouse and Advanced Publication. It's Newhouse owning it. That was like being in the you know, being a part of a princedom. And it was a kingdom. And, you know, then what was interesting was that the Newhouse family decided that books were finished, and nobody wanted to, I think it was when Cy was 70, and nobody in that family wanted to be part of publishing. They thought the newspapers and the magazines would work. Ooh. So they sold it to Bertelsmann. And, you know, then, you know, there was this big revolution, and my friend Jane Friedman was involved in that because she went to HarperCollins, but then she started this company called Open Road Media, where she took, this was ebooks, and she took all of these backlist books, these authors that had been out of print, and put them back in print and made this fabulous business out of it. And then also what happened, it keeps moving, because people loved reading ebooks, but they also loved reading books. And so independent bookstores have started to open. And, you know, I always can judge things. You know, I get around New York on my bicycle, but if it's raining, I'll take the subway. And I see people reading books. They're not just reading, or they're either playing video games or whatever on their iPhones, but a lot of them are reading books. And books are coming back, independent bookstores are open. And so, you know, who knows? The one thing that is a constant is that people want to tell a story.
Always. And we need people to help people tell those stories. Yes, you're right. So while we were all moaning and groaning at the turn of the century about the demise of publishing, I think there are more books being published today than there were then, if I remember my statistics correctly.
Well, but you know, we just have to get some more bookstores, and you know, but everything is constantly shifting, and people just love, I mean, they love to hear stories, but everybody wants to write a book.
Well, a lot of people have a book in them.
And they do. I mean, look at Janet.
Yes, yes. Good point. Good point. Now, can we talk a little bit about other aspects of your life? Because you're not just a vice president and not just an editor. You were also appointed by Bill Clinton to the Commission on Civil Rights. Talk about that and what happened.
Well, that was a great story, because what happened was that I published this woman named Mary Frances Berry, and she was the head of the Commission on Civil Rights. And they came into New York to hold hearings on Amadou Diallo. I don't know if you remember that. He was a man who was beaten brutally by the police. And they were going to come in and hold hearings, and I asked Mary if I could go down and watch this hearing. And she said, of course. So I came down, went down, and there were the police who were sitting, testifying, you know, starting with each one going down in order of hierarchy, each one wearing fewer buttons than the next person. And behind me and around me were people whose children or husbands or wives had been basically killed by the police or had had an encounter that was not good. And I listened to this, and at lunch I said to Mary, you know, your commissioners are great, but they're not asking tough questions. And like a wiseacre, I said, well, put me on that commission and I'll really go after them. Because it was sort of infuriating how these police commissioners were not answering in the way that they should have. And then I forgot all about it. And this wonderfully important major jurist, Leon Higginbotham, died. And Mary called me and said, would you consider being on the commission? And I said, great, what do I have to do? And I said, do I have to go through a Senate confirmation hearing? And she said no. But what she didn't tell me is that I had to fill out the exact same form and the financial disclosures as if I were running for president of the United States.
Oh my.
And it took me 3 months to get through it. Not that I had any financials of any complication, but anyway, this was before 9/11. It's a funny story. So one day I get a call from the FBI, and I said they were going to come and question me. And I said, okay, so they came in, they're wearing their guns, and I said, believe me, I am so boring. I have nothing, there's nothing there. And they had time on their hands. As I said, it was before 9/11. And so I gave them the telephone number I thought, who was going to get a kick out of hearing from the FBI? And have a house upstate, and there's a furniture maker who's the head of, he was an NRA person. I thought, he's going to love it. So I gave them his name. I gave them the name of one of my oldest friend in New York who went to PS6 with me, and they called her, and her name is Jeanette, and they said to Jeanette, okay, well, did she drink? And Jeanette said, no, she didn't, but I did. Did she take drugs? No, she didn't, but I did. Anyway, then I don't know how, I deliberately did not give them the name of Bob Gottlieb because I knew he was going to torture them. somehow he got the name, and they called Bob, and they said, "This is the FBI, we're calling about Victoria Wilson, she's not in any trouble." And Bob said, "If I know Vicki Wilson, she's not in any trouble, but you probably are." Anyway, so one day I came down, they were interviewing my doormen. I sent them to my veterinarian. Anyway, I passed, and I got on the commission. And you know, when you take that oath of office, it is the oath of office that you take if you're President of the United States or you're a lowly commissioner. And you know, I was just blithely going about, and all of a sudden, these words are coming out of your mouth, and they mean a lot.
Indeed.
And what happened was there was the election, the George Bush v. Gore. And the day after the election, I called Mary Berry and I said, "I think we have a civil rights issue and we need to go to Florida." And she said, "Well, let's see how it plays out." So in January, we went down. And you know, the commission was designed to be independent. It had subpoena power. So we subpoenaed everybody from Katherine Harris, Jeb Bush, they were all there. You know, we wrote our little report. I mean, it was very emotional. It was intense, because there were people there who had been disenfranchised in so many different ways. And the supervisors had all been fired. And so we had our report, and I wrote a concurring statement to our report. And when you write these concurring statements, you can't have a lawyer, a legal counsel or anything. You have to do it on your own. And I wrote this report, but I basically said that the press never got the story, because the story really was that when Katherine Harris had been elected the supervisor of the state, she had dismantled the entire voting apparatus of the state of Florida, which I don't know what it's like now, but then it was quite Byzantine and really sort of left over from, not the Civil War, but each county, if I'm not mistaken, had its own individual rules. And once those supervisors had been fired, there was just chaos, and nobody knew what they were doing. And so that's what happened in the election. It wasn't just about the Chads. It was about the fact that the supervisors didn't know. People were disenfranchised because they didn't get their cards, and it was a total mess. And they were Chris Dodd was about to present it in Congress. And the day before he was about to present it, 9/11 happened. And that was the end of that.
Right, right. Attention was diverted, and the scandalous, and it was scandalous, problems in Florida were just passed right over.
Right.
Ah.
But then I was on the commission. I loved the work. I absolutely loved the work. I love public service. You know, I keep saying that I want to run for mayor. Maybe I can make my announcement here. I'm running for mayor of New York City. Well, nobody else wants to be mayor of New York City, but I do. I love the city. I've lived there most of my life, though I do consider Martha's Vineyard as my home.
Marvelous. You have a house here?
No, I don't.
You don't?
No, we rent a house from Captain Morgan that we've rented in Menemsha for years and years and years. And it's a great house with a great view. It's very special. And I mean, we lived here all year round, and we had a house in Vineyard Haven, and then in the summer we had a house in West Tisbury. I have a house in upstate New York, and I bought it because, as I say, the vineyard has shaped everything about me. I bought it because it reminded me of West Tisbury, and it's in the middle of the Catskills. It's not the vineyard, but it's as close as I can afford to be at the moment.
Oh, I hear you. Yes, most of us who live here can't afford to live here, so.
I mean, I'm amazed at what houses in Vineyard Haven cost.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's sort of shocking. But you know, the magic of the island is that in most places, or in a lot of places, it stays the same. I mean, at one point, I have to tell you this, at one point we used to live on Crocker Avenue in Bays Norton's house. I walked down to the edge of the road. The pavement was still the same practically. And you know, my sister showed me the house was for sale, I guess, or maybe, oh no, they were renting it. And so there were pictures there, and I couldn't believe it. The furniture was exactly the same. The same bed in my parents' room. I kid you not. I mean, it's like you can't go home again, and when you can, I don't know if you want to that extent.
Because I live here full time, I do see a lot of shifting and a lot of changing. But I also spent most of my time in the vineyard riding horseback.
Oh.
And there are still places that you can go, and it's like, oh yeah, nothing's changed. This is why I live here. So I have to do that every so often.
You know, Jenny and I learned to ride at Tashmoo.
Oh, yes. Did you get to ride Clemmy and Cantor
Yes.
and Heather?
I can't believe you're saying that.
Because I rode those horses too.
I did,
Yes.
Clemmy. That was my horse.
And Kim, I used to get to ride Kim.
Oh, I don't remember, but you know, I remember it was Libby. Was it Libby Belden?
Yes, right, Libby and Elsie.
And they still, it still looks like it's intact.
There are still horses there. It's, yeah, which is lovely.
Is it privately? I mean,
Yes,
is it
privately owned.
I have a horse in upstate New York.
Do you? Excellent. And room to ride.
And a lot of room to ride. No, Jenny and I used to ride our bikes from Hines Point up there, and then we would come back and throw our bikes down and just go run off the dock and get into the water. No, and we used to, do you remember you'd go out and then you'd go up on the road and then you would ride a little way and then there'd be the rings sort of further in the woods.
Right, yes. The most marvelous thing is if you get to go to Tashmoo and you go into the barn and you look at the saddle racks in the tack room, there are the names, Cantor and Clemmy and Heather and Basra and Kair, and the names are all still there.
I can't believe it. I haven't
It's
thought about
wonderful.
Clemmy. I remember what she looked like.
It's
She had a
yes.
white.
Right. And she and Cantor were half siblings.
So where did you ride?
Mainly at Margie Manter's in West Tisbury. So,
yeah, I remember that.
But I also rode at Fenner's and I also rode at Tashmoo. So, you know, if you were a kid besotted with horses, you got around.
Did you ride in the fair?
Yes, did that too.
We did that too.
Did you?
Yeah.
Did you?
And I worked at the fair.
Oh, good for you.
I did.
You've done all of those.
And you know,
iconic
I'll
things.
tell you, my first job, and you know, I remember writing a letter and in January and getting the job secured, and it was a Green's vegetable stand.
Excellent. Now that is an iconic place.
It doesn't exist. I mean, there's still a farm stand.
Oh, there's somebody there, but right. Donnie Mills kept it going for a long time like Farmer Green's, but again, things change.
Yeah. I mean, I remember Robert Ryan used to come in all the time after going to the beach and pick up the vegetables. Anyway, it was a job. I loved it. I was very excited that I had it. It was a formal job on the vineyard.
Was Pedro still there? The parrot?
Yes.
Yes.
And Jackie was the daughter, wasn't
Yes, Jackie Green.
I can't believe that name just came back from absolutely outer space.
So have you ever thought of writing fiction? Is that at all interesting to you?
Yeah,
I mean,
it is.
And
there's only so much I can do. I mean, as it is, there are so many biographies I would love to write. And I've also thought of writing a book about my friendship with Jenny Painter, because that was Jenny Seward, excuse me.
yes.
That was a very interesting time. Now, I have thought about writing fiction, but first I have to get through this.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. No, we can't let you stop doing what you're doing. We need volume 2.
And people, you know, a lot of people have said, oh, you have to write your memoirs. Yeah, well, we'll see. I mean, I have, you know, I've had an interesting life and come across a lot of interesting, large people.
Yes, you have. And you hold your own with them. I can see that. So, but a little bit more about your job. What, day by day, what do you do? Are you looking at manuscripts? Are you discovering new writers? What are some of your responsibilities?
Well, I mean, I'm, you know, looking at manuscripts. You know, I've just made an arrangement with Rose Styron to publish her book, and she's she has a lot of stories, and Again, my friend Jane Friedman introduced me to her because she put Styron in in Open Road Media, and those books were very successful. You know, so through a series of connections or agents sending you things or you're reading something. In fact, a couple of years ago, I got in touch with Amy Klobuchar and suggested that she write a book. I suggested that, you know, she's very involved in antitrust in the Senate, and I said, why don't, you know, let's do a history of antitrust up to and including your work having to do with Amazon, Facebook, etc.
Oh, how interesting.
So it works in all kinds of different ways, but then you're also, you know, you're sort of moving these books along, and you're talking on the phone, and you're reading articles, and it's a constant education. It has been a total education, and it never stops, because as I wrote the book basically for me, so that I would be giving myself this education as I was writing this book. That's the way, you know, the people that it's such a wide-ranging list. I mean, it can be, you know, it ranges, you know, there was just a piece in the Times, I think it was yesterday, about William Gass, and his book, The Tunnel, which was, I published Bill Gass for 30-odd years, and The Tunnel was the first book of his that I published, and it's a very important novel that got attention, but now it's being rediscovered because, you know, 30 years ago, Bill Gass wrote this huge book that he had been working on for decades, which was a portrait of America, and he basically, you know, was 30 years ahead of his time in predicting a Trump America. And it's a portrait of that. And so that was what the piece was about in the Times. So anyway, it can range from Anne Rice to Lori Moore to, I'm publishing a book on affirmative action. I'm publishing a book on a woman who was a beekeeper for a year, and it's an amazing book, a really astonishing book on bees. And when I bought this book on affirmative action, who thought that affirmative action would be an explosive subject? And here it is, even with the issue of busing again.
It's all coming back. Yes, that wonderful phrase about those who are ignorant of history are doomed to repeat it. I also have to say, in talking about publishing and books and reading, I'm so aware of my grandchildren, and indeed I now have great-grandchildren, that they get their news in a very different way than I do. I still get a newspaper every day. It would never occur to me to go online to see what, but they all do. They only are streaming things. And as a result, fake news is a very real thing. Nobody looks at sources anymore. Now, you're a researcher. You know the importance of that. How do we counter that?
Well, you know, I published this book, this novel, wonderful novel by a woman named Annalena McAfee, who was married to Ian McEwan. And the first novel of hers that I published was a book called The Spoiler. And it was about a woman, a sort of Martha Gellhorn figure, who was this legend. And it's just at the cusp of the end of real research and the beginning of online research. And it's a portrait of what happens and the sort of superficiality of that, and of that kind of thinking. And the fun of writing a book is the research, because you are immersed in another time. I think I have the perfect life, because during the day I am in the present and the future, and at night I'm in the past. But you know, it's true, because I hate to say this, but I stopped getting the New York Times a year ago. I get it online. I read it online. And it is a very different experience. But, I mean, I just have to confess my sin that I do that. And then, you know, I do read newspapers online.
Well, that works for you. And it works for a lot of people. I worry about the future of newspapers.
Yeah. But I don't think there's anything that's been better for newspapers and for investigative journalism than Donald Trump.
Good point.
I mean, he's brought that back with a vengeance, and people are desperate for the information, and they're grateful to have it.
Yeah, I hear you loud and clear.
I will say this. You know, the life that I lead in the daytime is energy that is going out. It's going out for books, it's going out for writers, it's going out for agents, it's going out for thinking about making books and how to shape them and the copy and the jacket and all of that and how to sell them. And then at night, it's an energy that's going in. It's a completely different kind of energy. And that is a perfect balance. I wouldn't want to have a life where it's just in the past, because that would be almost dangerous to me. And I wouldn't want to have a life that's just in the present and the future, because that seems thin to me. I will say that, you know, writing is, it's hard. And it's fun. It's like playing the piano. It's like sitting down. Once you're there and you're in it, it's all about the focus. It's all about the focus. And that's what Janet was, that's what Janet's book is all about. It's that focus. It's being out there. In a million years, the last thing I would ever want to do is be out on that beach, at night when it's cold. And there was Tristan, her husband, was saying exactly what Jane and I were saying when she took us surf casting, which was, can we go home now? And Janet's, in her heaven. But that focus is exactly what is transformative. And that's the gift. That's the gift. So why don't we end there?
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. Thank you so much for being here today. This has been fascinating.
That was a great interview. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been The Vineyard View. I'm your host, Ann Bassett, saying keep your eye on MVTV and do look at Barbara Stanwyck, Volume 1. I'm immersed in it and loving it.